Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a closer look at the situation for Indigenous peoples globally, sort of a snapshot of where things stand in 2024.
That's right. We're working from a pretty detailed report, the Indigenous World 2025. It pulls together information from all over.
Exactly. You shared it because, the goal here is to get a handle on the really key issues, the main developments affecting these communities worldwide, but without getting lost in, well, every single detail.
hmm Our mission is basically to pull out those crucial insights. The report itself covers human rights, current events. It's quite comprehensive.
Okay, great. So jumping right in, what's sort of the big picture takeaway?
Well, it seems like despite, more global talk about climate change and human rights, Indigenous peoples are still facing some really significant hurdles.
But they're not just passive, right?
Yeah?
The report also shows they're actively pushing back.
Oh, absolutely. Actively engaged in asserting their rights, preserving their cultures. It's a constant effort.
And these challenges, they often seem connected, don't they? Like similar problems popping up in different places.
Very much so. You see these kind of overlapping pressures creating similar negative impacts across diverse regions.
Okay, so let's dig into one of those areas. Indigenous youth. The report flags some, frankly, quite worrying trends here. Forced migration seems to be a big one.
Yes, that comes up repeatedly. Places like Guatemala, Tunisia, Myanmar, Eritrea, Nicaragua. Quite a range.
Wow. So what's pushing young people out? Is it one thing or?
It varies. It could be economic pressures, violence, or like in Myanmar, a specific new conscription law that's literally forcing youth to flee.
And the consequences are pretty devastating, I imagine.
Yeah, tragically similar outcomes often. You see loss of cultural identity, loss of language, that vital transmission of ancestral knowledge gets broken.
Hmm.
And these young people, they become incredibly vulnerable, exposed to illicit activities, trafficking, forced game recruitment, drug trade. It's a dangerous situation.
So this isn't just about individuals moving. It's a threat to the whole community's future.
Exactly. This kind of widespread forced migration driven by all these factors, poverty, state violence, lack of opportunity, it really threatens the cultural survival of these communities. It's quite stark.
That Myanmar example you mentioned, the conscription law, that's a direct government action, derailing lives, forcing kids to abandon education, careers.
Precisely. And we see echoes of that, the forcible conscription aspect in Eritrea and Nicaragua, too. The report mentions this constant fear. Youth live under fear of roundups, detention, even torture if they try to escape.
It's just an unbearable environment.
Completely denies their basic rights.
And it takes other forms too, right? Like barriers that aren't necessarily violent, but still displace people.
Sure. In Thailand, for instance, the report mentions some indigenous youth lack citizenship,
This means.
which means limited access to basic services, can't get education loans, things like that.
And in Uganda, I remember reading about the Bené youth there.
Yes, facing harassment, beatings, restrictions on their culture. They're even stopped from participating in ancestral rituals.
Which again, forces them to migrate.
It does. It all adds up. These fundamental rights that, well, many people take for granted are just out of reach for so many indigenous young people.
So the big question hanging over this is,
Hmm.
what's the long-term impact? If the younger generation faces all this, how do they carry on their culture, their traditions?
That's the critical point. This potential break in passing down knowledge, heritage, it's a serious concern.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. The report also talks a lot about conflict stemming from green energy projects and resource extraction. This seems like a growing flashpoint globally.
It really does. And it highlights a key tension, doesn't it? We're all pushing for green energy to fight climate change.
Which sounds positive.
Right. The intention might seem good, but the way these projects are often implemented can be incredibly damaging for indigenous peoples and their rights.
Could you give some examples?
Well, look at the Philippines. The report mentions the Marcos Jr. administration is fast-tracking renewable energy and mining projects. But this is leading to direct conflict, especially in the Cordillera region. There are proposals for, I think, over 100 hydropower projects plus geothermal, solar, wind.
100. Wow.
Yeah, covering thousands of hectares. It fundamentally threatens the way of life, the very existence of the indigenous communities there.
So this top-down green solution versus indigenous rights to land and self-determination. Is that the core conflict?
That seems to be a defining conflict right now, yes. But it's not all bleak. There are instances of pushback.
Like where?
In the U.S., the report highlights some indigenous victories. The Hualapai tribe in Arizona got an injunction against a lithium project threatening a sacred site.
Lithium, right, crucial for batteries.
Exactly. And a federal judge actually made Enel Energy dismantle a wind farm on Osage Nation land. The judge ruled that building the turbine foundations counted as mining, which they didn't have a lease for.
That's fascinating. Foundations is mining.
It is. And then there's the removal of hydroelectric dams in California and Oregon. Salmon are returning to spawn. That's a huge positive change.
Those are definitely hopeful signs. Shows it's possible. But the challenges elsewhere are still massive.
Oh, definitely. Look at Kenya. The report points to a lack of transparency, no fair benefit sharing in mining deals. Communities are demanding investment, not just payouts.
Right.
And Malaysia hydro dams, solar farms, supposedly for climate mitigation, but going ahead without free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, from the Orang-Dasal communities.
FPIC. That's the key principle, isn't it? The right to say yes or no after being fully informed.
It's fundamental. And these projects in Malaysia are threatening displacement, potentially flooding ancestral lands. There's talk of reviving the huge Barham Dam project,
Which would affect thousands.
over 20,000 people potentially, and criticism of other projects bypassing FPIC too.
The situation in India sounds particularly worrying from the report. That Forest Conservation Amendment Act.
Yes, that's raising major alarm bells. It basically gives the central government more power to divert forest land for certain projects, potentially without the usual clearances.
Which could override existing forest rights. And FPIC.
Exactly. It's being challenged in the Supreme Court, but it's a serious concern for tribal communities.
And that's not all in India, according to the report.
Wow.
There was an order to evict tens of thousands of tribal families from tiger reserves.
Nearly 90,000 families, the report estimates. A massive potential displacement. Plus, reports of land grabbing, attacks on tribals resisting,
It sounds brutal.
and deeply disturbing accounts of police violence, alleged torture in several states, and horrific sexual violence against indigenous women and girls mentioned in places like Arunachal Pradesh, Karnataka, Chhattisgarh.
It's just awful. And then there's specific big projects, too.
Right, the Great Nicobar Infrastructure Project, huge ecological concerns there. And ongoing clashes over mining in the Hasdale-Aran forest region. It's a grim picture overall.
And this lack of consultation, lack of consent, it keeps coming up. Suriname, too.
Yes, the report mentions the government there signing an agreement, an MOU, with a Chinese mining company, Chinalco, apparently without the informed consent of indigenous communities in West Suriname.
Leading to criticism.
Strong criticism, yes, about the potential economic, environmental, and, well, human rights fallout for those communities.
So it's clear this fight over land, resources, and consent is central and deeply tied to these global economic pressures.
Absolutely.
Now, tied into that, I suppose, is the protection of indigenous intellectual property and cultural heritage. Why is this specifically important?
Well, it's about recognizing and legally protecting their unique knowledge, their innovations, their cultural expressions. This isn't just history, it's living tradition, often linked directly to their land and resources.
Okay.
There's that WIPO treaty, the Riyadh Design Law Treaty, which has a clause requiring disclosure of traditional knowledge in design applications. That's a step.
But not yet ratified by many.
Not ratified by any member states by the end of 2024, according to the report. But there are national efforts.
Like where?
Australia and Cameroon are mentioned as working on new laws. And the Australian Law Council put out a framework aiming specifically at recognizing Indigenous cultural heritage, ensuring self-determination in how it's protected.
Because existing legal systems often don't quite fit, right?
Right.
Communal ownership, oral traditions.
Exactly. Western IP law doesn't always align well. So these are important moves trying to prevent that knowledge or culture from being unfairly used or appropriated without permission.
It's about acknowledging it as dynamic, living heritage.
Precisely. Vital steps.
Okay, so another theme the report hits hard is challenges to cultural identity itself and freedom of expression. This feels closely linked to everything else we've discussed.
It absolutely is. Take Tunisia and the Amazi people there. The report talks about policies of forced assimilation, displacement.
Forcing people out of traditional areas.
Yes. Territories being emptied, youth having to leave for cities or even go abroad just to find opportunities. It erodes cultural identity significantly.
And there are fears about new laws targeting Amazi groups.
Concerns that a new law on associations could be used to further restrict their organizations and cultural expression, yeah.
The situation in Algeria sounds extremely serious, too. The writer, Belem Sansal,
Yes, an amaze writer from Kabylia known for criticizing the government. The report mentions his abduction, detention, and that he potentially faces the death penalty. That's a major attack on free expression.
And others targeted too.
A French writer, Dominique Martre, arrested and deported for her book on Kabylia. And a Mesa publishing house, Cuckoo Editions, reportedly excluded from book fairs. It suggests a pattern of suppression.
And Libya. Similar issues for the Amazi there.
Seems so. Cultural discrimination, limits on free expression, activists arrested, reports of ill treatment, plus economic neglect, disparities in development plans affecting Ameza communities, even a border post closure impacting an Ameza town.
What about Morocco? Didn't they recognize the Ameza language in their constitution?
They did, back in 2011, recognized Ameza identity and language. But the report suggests implementation has been, well, slow.
How so?
Tamazight language teaching hasn't fully rolled out. Linguistic discrimination apparently continues, like the Tifana script, the Amazi script, still missing from official documents. And the Amazi movement itself actually rejected the methods and results of the 2024 census regarding Tamazight speakers, so still a lack of meaningful recognition in practice.
So even where there's formal recognition on paper, the reality on the ground can be very different.
That gap remains a huge challenge globally, yes.
Okay, let's pivot back to land rights and relocation. This really seems foundational to so many issues.
It truly is. Land for Indigenous peoples isn't just, property. It's tied to identity, spirituality, livelihood. So dispossession, forced relocation. The impact is profound and lasting.
We see this playing out in Botswana.
Yes, with the Tsutsuga residents reportedly being pressured to relocate. There's skepticism about fair land allocation, ongoing concerns about discrimination against the Basarwa or San people.
And in Namibia, the situation for the San sounds dire.
Over 80% dispossessed of ancestral lands, according to the report, making them among the poorest, most marginalized groups, although there are some government-supported programs for education and training.
South Africa seems like a mixed bag. They supported UNDRIP, but implementation is lagging.
Somewhat, yes. Implementation of relevant international human rights conventions is noted as limited, but the traditional and Khoisan leadership bill is seen as a positive step in recognizing their leadership structures.
And that Robos protocol.
The Robos Biocultural Community Protocol, yeah, that's highlighted as showing the value of traditional knowledge.
What about East Africa? Tanzania and Uganda.
In Tanzania, Maasai protests against government actions impacting their land and services in Ngorongoro did lead to some government concessions, which is interesting. Shows collective action can have an effect.
But in Uganda?
Ongoing issues for the B'nai youth, violations of their land and forest access rights by the Wildlife Authority. The government proposed reopening park boundaries, but apparently no action yet.
So, promises, but no follow-through.
Seems that way.
Turning to Latin America, Bolivia faced terrible forest fires. How did that impact indigenous territories?
Devastatingly. Huge impact. But, interestingly, amidst that, the report notes the creation of the first indigenous conservation area in the Amazon, established by an autonomous indigenous government. That's a significant move towards self-management.
That's interesting. But other situations sound more complex, like in Guatemala with the carbon credits.
Right. The government allocated forest carbon credit income to Amerindian villages, but reportedly without consulting them first, and with strings attached on how the money could be spent, limits their autonomy.
And land titling there is still difficult.
Yes, described as complicated and often inaccessible.
In Costa Rica, a law on indigenous autonomy stalled for 30 years.
30 years, yeah. Astonishing. Plus a lack of published census data on the indigenous population, which makes them even more invisible in policymaking.
Ecuador sounds like the national situation is impacting indigenous peoples negatively.
The report suggests so, yeah. The political and economic climate isn't helping. Mining projects like La Plata are causing conflict and repression, despite constitutional rules about consultation.
But there was one win. A prison project halted.
Yes. Prison construction in Napo was suspended after indigenous communities raised concerns.
And Guyana. Mining issues there too.
Deep suffering reported in Chinese Landing because the government banned mining there, again, without consultation.
Mexico has made constitutional changes, but implementation is still a problem.
That's the picture painted, yes. Reforms recognizing indigenous peoples as rights holders, but challenges remain in making that a reality on the ground.
But there are also stories of active resistance, right? In Peru.
Definitely. The Wampis people are mentioned using self-defense strategies against illegal mining and logging. And Kakama youth are using video, a powerful tool to document their culture, language, and their fight to defend their territory.
That's really proactive.
It is. And in Chile, too, indigenous youth facing discrimination but playing a key role in claiming rights, strengthening culture through digital tech, activism against harmful projects.
Chile also has a new biodiversity law. Does that help?
It includes some provisions for indigenous consultation and conservation areas, which is positive, but the report notes implementation challenges, especially with applications for these coastal marine areas for indigenous peoples, ECMPOs.
And lithium mining is a big issue in Chile.
Huge tensions, yes, especially in the north, over water access and environmental damage in indigenous territories.
Venezuela sounds particularly concerning regarding land rights.
The report describes invasion and dispossession of indigenous lands being essentially tolerated by the state. And these imposed integral development associations are undermining traditional indigenous governance.
Not great. But Colombia hosted a summit on traditional knowledge.
Yes, the World Summit on Traditional Knowledge related to Biodiversity TRUA, held in preparation for COP16 on biodiversity. So some positive international focus there.
Okay, that leads us nicely into the final major theme. Political participation. Crucial for self-determination, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely fundamental. Having a voice, being part of the decision-making. Some progress noted. Yeah. More inclusion in decision-making counselors, government, Senate positions, initiatives for inclusion in education, civil registration too. But still a need for programs to support indigenous youth leaders.
China's focus on a unified Chinese nation community. That raises concerns.
Yes, concerns among minority nationalities, including indigenous groups, about what that means for their distinct identities and autonomy rights.
And the EU has raised human rights concerns.
Specifically about Xinjiang and Tibet, yes, including reports about Tibetan children being abducted, government interference in selecting religious leaders. The policy prioritizing a single national identity is the core issue raising flags.
What about Nepal?
Continued criticism noted for violations of international law and human rights standards concerning indigenous peoples. But, on the upside, a youth summit empowered indigenous voices. And Cultural Works Films plays highlighted indigenous issues.
Land commission issues persist, though.
Yes, those seem ongoing. And culturally, the film Shambhala was their Oscar entry.
Thailand still facing land rights challenges.
Seems so. Forestry policies creating housing and land rights issues. Progress on securing rights is slow, despite advocacy, and conflict continues over a coal mining project in one village.
Argentina's move to abolish the National Registry of Indigenous Communities. That sounds like a step backwards.
It drew significant criticism, yeah. Concerns that it effectively negates their very existence as distinct peoples in the eyes of the state.
Bolivia's political crisis affected indigenous judicial candidates, but there was one positive election.
Right. A Mojeño lawyer was elected to the Agro-Environmental Court, which is seen as a significant development despite the broader challenges.
Taiwan seems to be engaging on climate change and indigenous rights.
Yes, holding a public hearing on indigenous carbon sinks, acknowledging the need to safeguard their rights in climate responses. Also progress on recognizing Pingpu indigenous groups, though challenges remain there too.
New Caledonia's situation sounds tense after the referendum.
Very. The no vote on independence led to frustration among the Kanak people. And that French government martyr project aimed at removing New Caledonia from the UN decolonization list and potentially extinguishing Kanak rights without consultation or FPIC, that's raised serious alarm.
Papua New Guinea has made legislative changes to protect land rights.
Reportedly, yes. Aimed at better protection, more control over extractive industries, and crucially, requiring FPIC.
Canada, the Hated Nation title was recognized, but broader policy issues remain.
Exactly. No progress reported on withdrawing federal policies based on the extinguishment of Aboriginal rights entitled despite that win.
But there's the Inuit Nunangat policy.
Yes, created as a distinct region to give Inuit greater say. But challenges persist, like lack of education and employment opportunities for youth in Kalalit Nunaat, which is Greenland.
Russia limited consultation rights, but no FPIC.
That's the assessment. Limited consultation for indigenous small-numbered peoples, but FPIC isn't legally enshrined, plus a reported erosion of the legal framework and more centralization.
USA tribes are sovereign, but it's limited.
Inherently sovereign, but with curbed sovereignty, is how it's often described. And concerns in New Zealand about a bill potentially threatening Treaty of Waitangi rights.
And Australia, ongoing issues with the justice system and heritage laws.
Yes. Continued overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the justice system, rising incarceration rates, and concerns that Western Australia's heritage laws might breach international standards.
Okay, so that covers a lot of ground regionally. Finally, the report looks at the international level engagement rights mechanisms.
Right, the bigger picture framework. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights reviewed state reports, issued statements highlighting ongoing challenges.
The Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD.
Parties committed to submitting their national biodiversity plans. And that World Summit on Traditional Knowledge we mentioned fed into preparations for COP16.
What about the EU and UN bodies?
The EU has human rights mechanisms that include engaging civil society on Indigenous issues. The FAO facilitated spaces for Indigenous youth at global events. The UN Permanent Forum focused specifically on youth in 2024.
And the Summit of the Future.
Adopted the Pact for the Future and the Global Digital Compact both include commitments related to Indigenous knowledge and participation. At the climate talks, UNFCCC COP29, the mandates for the Facilitative Working Group and the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform were continued. Important platforms.
But Indigenous people still feel excluded sometimes.
Yes, at the high-level political forum, they raised concerns that their realities aren't reflected in national reports, and they're often shut out of decision-making.
The Green Climate Fund, does it have safeguards?
Its criteria for REDD plus projects include UNFCCC safeguards and an independent complaints mechanism, an IRM.
And there are tools for Indigenous peoples themselves.
The Indigenous Navigator, that's an online portal for data collection and advocacy led by Indigenous communities.
Very valuable.
And the various UN treaty bodies. They continue to issue recommendations to countries on Indigenous rights land, resources, culture, participation, and they rule on individual complaints.
UNESCO World Heritage Sites, too.
Yes, the committee made decisions on sites in Indigenous territories, often expressing concern about human rights abuses and urging stronger protections, more rights-based approaches. And WIPO's committee continues negotiations on protecting traditional knowledge and cultural expressions internationally.
Wow. Okay. That's a lot. An incredibly complex global picture.
It really is, spanning so many issues, so many regions.
So let's try and pull out some threads. What are the key global trends we've seen emerge from this deep dive?
Well, I think it's clear Indigenous peoples worldwide are grappling with these deeply interconnected challenges, right? It consistently comes back to fundamental land rights, the impacts often negative of resource extraction, both old and new.
Like the green energy conflicts we discussed.
Exactly. Then there's the constant struggle to keep cultures and languages alive, vibrant, and the fight for real political participation, genuine self-determination.
Having a real say in their own futures.
Precisely. And woven through all of this is the situation of Indigenous youth, often particularly vulnerable, but also increasingly stepping up as key advocates for change.
Was there anything in the report that particularly jumped out at you? Maybe something surprising or just really telling?
A few things. That U.S. court ruling calling wind turbine foundations mining, that was certainly unexpected, with potentially big implications.
Yeah, that was interesting.
And the sheer proactive resilience, like the Wampus youth in the Amazon using self-defense strategies for their territory, or the Kukama youth using video to document and defend their culture. That's powerful stuff.
He really is.
And then on the flip side, the sheer inertia sometimes, like that indigenous autonomy law in Costa Rica just stalled for decades. It really highlights the deep political blockages that still exist.
So for someone listening, trying to stay informed about global affairs, why does understanding all this matter? What's the relevance?
Well, I think it gives you a crucial and often missing perspective on almost every major global challenge we face. Climate change, economic development, human rights.
You can't understand those fully without this perspective.
I don't think so. It forces you to look beyond the headlines, consider diverse viewpoints, and really question the impacts of policies, even well-intentioned ones, on communities on the ground. It underlines why things like FPIC are so vital, why we need genuine partnership, not just top-down decisions.
Okay, so here's the final thought, something for listeners to really chew on. We're facing this urgent need for climate action, massive demand for resources. How can governments, international bodies, corporations, how can they truly make sure indigenous rights, traditional knowledge, cultural heritage aren't just footnotes, but are genuinely respected, protected, and woven into the solutions?
That's the billion-dollar question, isn't it?
How do we move from just trying not to cause harm to actually empowering indigenous communities as essential partners in tackling these global crises instead of sidelining them? And maybe what role can individuals play in amplifying those voices, ensuring they're heard and respected globally?
That's a lot to think about indeed. And it really requires ongoing attention, ongoing engagement from everyone.